the insurrectionist separatist Confederates seeking the enforcement of the wizard communism for the white supremacists, the central planned economy designed to promote those for the changing of status and of currency, generating the pretense of society, at which point, after they have been properly laundered and filtered, they can be tolerated in their position or intolerated for their position from the central planning, at which point they claim that they are no longer being racist because it's a matter of the attacks on status and poverty and not on the attacks on race, which has led to their central planning development, including but not limited to the development of the house nigger, who, having been promoted, generates the position of having betrayed their community, and as long as they are necessary to tolerate, they shall be tolerated, and given their status until they are no longer useful, at which point the clan insurrectionists will betray them, similar to the historic position of the Jews who betrayed the black community in order to make a peace agreement with the KKK, who then turned on them once the objective had been finished. At which point, choose your friends more carefully than your enemies. They might actually be your enemies. To this extent, you understand that their projections from the past into the future, we call the present, generates the normal military operations against the civilian populations, similar to the Killers of the Flower Moon and other generations, such as tactics, such as the creation of um, the buffalo, which, having been mass killed, have been centralized under the control of the white supremacists who have taken over the position, who, not being particularly interested in the development of preserving nature, has cornered the market and has used the tactics of hunting the buffalo against the general population, such as the Killers of the Flower Moon tactics, which, if you watch the movie, which I highly encourage, you'll be able to see, as well as the uh, the movie with Nicolas Cage starring is The Butcher's Crossing, which has demonstrated the techniques of hunting the buffalo, which they're using against the civilian population, because people are stupid and functionally herd animals, and thus the position of them avoiding the danger of having contracted the hunters to protect them has generated the pretense of themselves becoming prey as they are systematically dismantled and reorganized into the white supremacist communism, generating the pretense of their horrendous abuses against them, which they have accepted according to their own stupidity and because of their own cowardice. They have submitted to these things, generating the pretense of the social engineerings of the magic systems and psychological experiments which have been conducted around the United States and around the world, which has been practiced by the CIA and others, which have been infiltrated by the Klan operations in order to conduct their satanic rituals against the civilian population for the maximizing of the commissions, which is the selling of souls to hell, which, by the devil worshippers submitting to that structure, collect commissions according to the religion for the mass ingestion of the higher quantity of souls that have gone to hell because of them. Now, if they are of the higher level of that mechanism, then they have to disconnect themselves from the liability of having been guilty, at which point there's a specific method for them to conduct this, which is actively aligned with the Butcher's Crossing reference tactics, including the thing being their own fault, the act of having warned them and having told all of the things and conducted all the services, and have the morons still fall into the trap and actively cycle themselves through until the herd has been fully destroyed, and it then becomes an active infection inside social functions such as the church in order to create the satanic worship under the guise of the worship of the legitimate religions. At which point, this actively becomes the status quo function of their harassment and abuse from their electronic harassment surveillance techniques, which includes the mechanism of their false scientific experiments where they had killed monkeys by radio signals and other um, frequency based weapons, which are able to penetrate walls, such as their technology to hack people's nerves and force them to speak, which is in friendly fascism as a normal tool of the FBI, which elicits false confessions by coerced speech and other things along those lines, which is actively reinforced for the Satanists in this activity, which has generated the pretense of their estimate of David, which has made him their primary adversary, according to that, as the legitimate patriarchy is a fire tiger which eats them the coyote. The children of Cain view themselves as coyotes, and each other, having hunted the general public as an exponential function of their existence, fear a proper strong predator, which would then kill them instead of their preferred prey. At which point, the position of the coyote is that if you kill one, then they'll breed a lot more. At which point, the act of trying to kill them off increases the breeding, which is the general tactic used in the preservation of their mentality or spirit animal. And thus, the spirit animal, being the primary mechanism, generates the pretense of their poacher's mechanism, which has targeted various people based upon their spiritual spirit animal. At which point, the act of poaching them then dissects them and creates the various uh, material components for their hellish function, which is specifically to be derived for their own interests according to the deals with the devils, at which point, however that's supposed to work out for them, would mostly be transformed on the basis of the degree of knowledge, such as the foundation of the concept of 33 degrees. Thus, the first degree will have a completely different mentality than the fifth degree, will have a completely different mentality than the 10th degree. At which point, the function of the demonic is the active coercion amongst all of the subordinates, at which point the subordination generates the collage of mental intentions. And the collage of mental intentions stops it from being the concept of one person having an identity, so much as it is the active title is actively fought over and negotiated for by the various mechanisms and can actively be replaced by any of the participants. At which point they engage in some kind of mosh pit function, which generates those who hold the title and then trade it to the others based upon their various interests, such as special missions that the stronger party isn't interested in fulfilling, and thus they would subcontract an inferior party in order to do the function instead. Similar to the function in D&D, where the devils and demons contract inferior devils or demons to speak whenever they're summoned, at which point the subcontracted function does not bother them anymore, at which point the thing doesn't disturb them and everything becomes automated. It's this kind of idea. At which point their targeting structure on the foundation of their satanic evils as a chaotic evil, as a elemental evil, as their core functioning social identity. generates the status quo function of those degrees of knowledge, of occult knowledge, of systematically revealing layer by layer the new intricacies of how they conduct society. And having conducted their poaching operations, have used their access to the United States military intelligence operating functions in order to establish their objective targets against any challengers to the white supremacist communism. At which point, their discovery of secrets which would have been hidden from them then becomes a mechanism for their targeting. Thus, those who challenge the Confederacy, such as those who have been trading in the free market under their estimate, who would have been important, such as having a Hawaiian sea stone, which is the foundation of all credit, uh, generates the stable function or cornerstone of the market and its trades. At which point, because the cornerstone exists, they can make these trades in good faith, which is balanced by the cornerstone. And these cornerstones become the legend companies of each of the targets in the general community. At which point, they trade off of the cornerstones, and then the trade is good and everything's fine, and eventually everything settles and bygones become bygones. At which point they then target the legend company's corresponding person and then poison them, and thus the creation of the special needs children um, is generated by the poisonings, by the Confederacy conducting false experiments, which they know the result of what they're doing is going to be. It's not an experiment. They don't, there isn't a question about what's going to happen. This is an active military campaign. This is a hate crime. They are actively doing these massed functions for the purpose of their hate crimes. And thus you have those parties who are created and abused, and sometimes they find them a bit later, and the person becomes successful in the general community, and they then attack and destroy them and make them homeless and destroy them and throw them in prison and do all of the normal bullshit where people, having been harassed and terrorized, say the government's after me, the government's after me, and it becomes its own functional joke to make fun of these types of people, most of which probably, on a high likelihood, would actually be victims of that thing, as it does serve the normal function of the Satanists. At which point, those harassment and battery campaigns by those satanic surveillance operators for the KKK contracts are then subcontracted as individual contractors separate to the government, giving the false presumption that they are an independent of the government function while conducting a function of the government against the American law, which prohibits them from doing that, creating this complication for the occult knowledge to be revealed, which is then disseminated, which then would be put in its proper place, which is why they keep the complications and the law enforcement from being able to do it. So their targeting of people such as David would be essential to the law enforcement, such as the intelligence oversight, military police, investigating them would find these operations from their William Barr's NSA hybrid chimera bullshit thing to destroy the general public would then be dismantled systematically, as they do not have a legal basis in their operations and thus engaged in a criminal conspiracy against the government of these United States, leading to the function of the retaliation against those targets who, having been responsible originally in their estimate, having dismantled their crimes, were then preempted and attacked on that basis to conduct the sedition so that the law enforcement mechanism would not happen and thus allow their criminal behavior to continue unbothered. And thus the mechanism of the Satanists actively engaging themselves uh, are self-recognized as children of Cain or coyotes. And the advantage of coyotes is their ability to hyperbreed with each other in the midst of an emergency. So their ability to reproduce, because one of theirs doesn't return, they then have another coyote breed instead of it, and thus they have an epidemic of coyotes if you start hunting coyotes. And thus these contingencies are actively generated as public threats, requiring complete systematic actions in order to eradicate them, which conceptually in this idea with the Satanists requires absolute consistent force by the entire government structure at every level, which cannot allow the reproduction. At which point, the system of creating the exact mechanism would have to be a secret. The FBI claims, under its normal protocols, that the targets shouldn't know about it, but were forced by Congress to admit to it. So when the people say that the government's after me, it's because the FBI had to tell them because Congress compelled them to. At which point you have that mechanism, which is self-realization. To this extent, you need to expand the mechanism of hunting those coyotes, which has generated their targeting of that mechanism, and thus the enforcement of their communism requires the lack of the security, requires the sedition, which is their systematic sedition against the United States, which by the United States law purges them from the United States government and its benefits for their insurrectionist behavior, which may not be protected against. They do not have immunity. They may not be forgiven. They may not be pardoned. There is no forgiveness. They are exclusively 100% just a public threat, and they need to be treated like the 9/11 terrorists that they are. The remedies must be enforced. Thus, the mechanism has to be restored for the law enforcement, and thus you have to force the duel, which requires Congress to acknowledge David at his obstructed time and with the privileges allotted by his birthright and the contract schedule, which makes him the intelligence oversight general, which allows him to conduct the law enforcement against the government as a mechanism of Congress. Now, the question that they have about the submission to the president is irrelevant, as all members of the United States military are subordinate to the president, but the president is submitted to the function of the specialty of the checks and balances of the other branches. Congress, in its specialty, is above the president in that matter. The judiciary is above the president in their specialty on the matter, and thus the position that the president could fire him is then nullified by the advance of the specialty, which requires the enforcement, which they are subverting for the sedition, which requires that active acknowledgement of base logic to be enforced as a consistent mechanism for our existence to be sustained. Or, being too stupid to live, we will crumble into nothing, and our enemies will take advantage of our chaos and infighting and self-destructive the mechanisms of all of the spoils of war, which has been sold already by the Confederacy in order to instigate these functions, for their profits are primarily derived by their spiritual contracts with the deals with the devils, so that they, being able to have somebody else be guilty, can exclusively collect the commissions for the souls that they have destroyed. And thus the profits of financial and other benefits would then go to the other parties that divided it in the black market trade, such as through the Terror Factory, which has generated the crimes and is allowing it to go to the furthest extent, allowing their position to have laundered all of the crimes and the profits from the crimes, purifying themselves, keeping clean hands while the trade is conducted, improving their status in hell. And that is the core concept of the Confederates' social identity, which they are to be confined under the United States law into their own state, where they then will be subjugated to their legal statuses on that basis, as well as the compulsion for them to exist in their own society according to their legal status. And in that mechanism, we can fundamentally leave them alone, at which point just stay out of their jurisdiction. And if any foreigners try and cross the border and go into their jurisdiction, it's not America's problem. But by definition, it is the United States' responsibility to warn them about the Confederacy's jurisdiction and the potential consequences of dealing with these degenerates directly. And if they're captured and kidnapped, then they will not be rescued, and there will be normal functions of society which they will conduct against them, which may be viewed as particularly unpleasant, as they are all Confederate militia, and the KKK, being the Confederate militia, has a history of treating particular groups that they view as not the right type of white in these abusive manners, reflecting their satanic loyalties. David is not allowed under American law to conduct the genocide against them, and thus the existence of their Confederate state is problematic, as their very existence is a threat to human society, and thus is a problem. It's easier and more effective for security interest. The military position is extermination of the terrorists, but practically terrorism is their social agreement. That is their entire identity, and thus the technicalities of genocide requires their preservation in their own particular hellhole at the border where they could live in the desert and continue their normal practices. And thus, in their practices, they're actively engorged in themselves into the function of the religion of the devils, which, according to the mechanism of their Canaanite mixed religion, had watchers, such as the watchers from Enoch, come down from heaven, which taught them sciences such as the secrets of the stars, which is basically horoscopes and the rest of them. At which point, these alternative sign mechanisms are actively a part of the religion, which has led to their hunting of spirit animals with each of the particular parties, which generates exactly what kind of poachers they are and the types of things that they want to do with each of their targets for the poaching, which generates the pretense of the specific type of abuse. And thus, their estimate of David assumes the position of his caravan, which leads to him driving the lead of the military operations of his convoy with his semi truck, which would have been generated the reflection of it is Optimus Prime as the leader of that mechanism, where they then would do whatever special mission that they would be on as a normal function of the training. And since he would functionally consistently be in a caravan, it would be inconsistent for him to be able to exercise with normal equipment, because not all of the places are going to have all of the right equipment in the right way until it's matured, which requires them to have the alternative mechanisms, which generates the position of the changing the light bulbs for the radio towers, which is more exercise than it is financial. But the contract would exist and it would still make money. He would still profit off of all of his hobbies, but it's an exercise. There are radio towers everywhere he would go. Thus, the radio tower proves that the existence of the society, which needs the radio tower, so they're going to be at all of the locations. And these types of alternative exercise mechanisms is what he would be primarily be reliant on outside of the traveling kits or portable versions. Um, for each of the locations would have their own specialty thing, but the portable versions, such as dumbbells and stuff, um, these types of things specify the type of abuse that they would prefer to conduct against the victim for the specific interest of how they want to dissect um, the poached spirit animal, generating whatever material they're looking for. But it's their own collage of their own special type of art to conduct the abuses in this specific manner, and thus the mechanism assumes that David's caravans would be traveling primarily at night, specifically for the purpose of collecting any road damages, which are usually conducted between midnight and 6 a.m., and thus the ability to clean them up as quickly as possible becomes a high priority, and thus the mechanism means that whenever he would come into a new town before the sun rises, he can then do the exercise with the radio tower, and thus the position becomes that he is Lucifer Morningstar because he's changing the light uh, at the sunrise. Basically, think of the most meta thing possible, and that's probably an accurate idea of what they were aiming at. So the question comes up, such as in The Office, where Michael Scott is asked, do you want to be loved or do you want to be feared? And Michael Scott looks to the camera and says, is it too much to ask for both? And thus, this is the basic concept of what they thought David was going to be doing, as the normal function of him being born under the original contract schedule requires the peace agreement with the Confederates, which requires them to have sold him Hollywood and a campus in Malibu, which they would have to be constructing, which would then reflect his Fey foundation, which means by definition they would be hiding it. It's basically just a security base with a luxurious campus that's being disguised, probably covered by a field of a bunch of specifically tailored flowers and raising bees or something. This, as a general concept, means that David would be raised in the starting parts of his life in the art school and with the highly charismatic um, bunch from Hollywood, which would then create the normal function of love bombing as a standard function of leadership and engagement in all of the relationships, at which point that as a status quo function, constantly traveling on all of the contract schedules around the world, would then generate the introduction of new peoples who he would only see for a small period of time, and thus he would have to be normalized to the position of the law of bombing. At which point, this would actively encourage them to, you know, put themselves into acquiring status for from the bonus credit score, which would then normalize the ingestion and acceleration of the network as a whole, and thus the mechanism of David's system being based upon the brokerage as the cornerstone of the market creates the antitrust function of anything that he has to do himself is a temporary function that he would rather sell to somebody else and start an account with, and then the normal function of that account would create commissionable trades, at which point the antitrust and the building of the foundation of the market to the middle class generates the status quo function of his treaty with the United States and others for economic security, which is the status quo assumption of each of the normal relationships that they believe that they are targeting for the destabilizing of the United States. Thus, the record reflects that Lindsey Graham has a character which targeted David by these illegal surveillance systems to conduct economic violence, social violence, and other hate crimes for the specific goal of destabilizing the United States and traumatizing it into the corded off and sold portions to its enemies, as they are and have always been traitors to these United States. As a positive reference, it's important to understand. Um, Take for example the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's a scene where Lucy is first meeting Aslan, and I think she was with the beaver, and she asked the beaver, "Is he safe?" And the beaver says, "He's a lion. He's not safe at all. But I think you'll find that he's good." And that is basically a fundamental concept that they would be conceiving as a cornerstone of the manifestation of everything that they hate, and thus the existence of true masculinity, and thus the irreverence of hypermasculinity generates the opposition to their beta society, which is derived by infighting and scams, at which point the existence of the backstabbing system is fundamentally opposed to the concept of the existence of patriarchy and thus male leadership, and thus the existence of a stable, organized society where all of the particular parties are appropriately represented, and thus the mechanism of them and thus the existence of them being led is not them being corralled like cattle to be slaughtered and put into their correct place, such as, but it's not limited to, the Confederacy's rape culture, which has guaranteed that they, to be extorted, do not have actual material leadership. The non-profit David Foundation Incorporated, conducting the non-profit function of the patriarchy, would have systemic non-profit functions which it would automate its payments for collecting profitable contracts in order to distribute the nonprofit function resources. Thus, most nonprofits fall victim to being subordinated to their donors and being obligated to their donors to conduct certain things, begin to build corruption. And thus, being self-sufficient is foundational concept to the hypermasculinity believed about David in the original timeline, projected as the motive of the insurrectionists to undermine. And thus the position of the obstructed contract schedule must be rejuvenated. And thus one of the fundamental nonprofit functions would have to have been rebuilding the original economy under the obstructed contracts, and thus the restoration of the businesses and other related functions reconstructs the free market. And thus the free market, being dependent on David Bowles, would then have to have David's companies restored. And thus the position of their profits as companies would be paying into the nonprofit, which would be purchasing the services until they've grown to maturity off of the work, which are then anything beyond the cost of business would be donated back into the foundation, as the rest of the United States and its interest have to be reconstructed from that position, which includes but is not limited to the duel where Congress, being compelled to recognize David in an obstructed state at the obstructed time, would have to recognize that contract schedule and restore him to the original position, facilitating the existence of law enforcement, at which point the United States rule of law demands submission to David's positions under these positions, which have been attacked by the Confederate insurrectionists. And thus the separatists have had the specific interest to have destroyed it by their criminal war against the United States government. At which point, the separatists in the duel argue for the Confederacy to overthrow the United States, and the United States argues to overthrow the Confederacy and to subordinate it into its own jurisdiction to preserve the devil worshippers society and their dumpster fire. At which point, whichever one Congress votes for is going to have supporters on both ends who will then fight to support X, Y, or Z, and thus the act of encouragement under the original protocols would be to get as many of them as possible to subordinate to the United States by nonviolent means at the point of a gun, because law enforcement and national security may not be tolerated to be impudent, which Congress has reaffirmed exponentially by the excessive funding of the contractors, which generates the status quo precedent of endorsing absolute force being the backside of noncompliance with reasonable demands. There is legally no immunities for them for attacking the sovereign and its interests, and thus there is no pardon or forgiveness for their position. They are separatists without American law to protect them, and thus the position is described in the arts as thus: those that would go after the devil and forego law in order to do so will then be caught having the devil without laws to protect him. And what do you think the devil would do to him without any laws to defend them? And thus the express position of the sons of perdition and their insurrection do not have protections. The sons of Cain do not have protection. The coyotes do not have legal security, as they are lawless degenerates threatening public security. The restitution of the original order is essential as a function under the patriarchy, and thus the engagement of the original relationships being returned to their original status minus debts and liabilities that they would have generated includes, but is not limited to, the function of the catering, and thus the assault conducted by the insurrectionists would create a meme version of the original free market version, which was attacked in order to decrease status and then create a smear factory and defamation racket. And thus the mechanism of that shiny title, specifically whatever it is from David's, would generate the catering, which is the zombie insurance function of the state of emergency, which would have the top-rated cooks in order to generate the meals, which would be contracted. The staff would have the 9-course meals, and then they would be donating it all of the way down through all of the functions of the foundation, at which point the general society would become stabilized. And then the function of the School of Hard Knocks, which would have to be restored under Don Senior Bowles' title, which would generate the education, restoring all of the permits and licenses and general life knowledge, such as taxes and everything that high school doesn't teach you, and whatever else thing needed to happen, such as the active investigation of each specific policy and its full due diligence and complications, as the devil is in the details, and thus he sells small print. And thus the function requires the engagement that they um, engorse themselves in the entire competence and knowledge, including the investigation in the obstructed policies and the outcomes, as the historic position of the obstructed contracts require them to be informed and non-abused by the social violence to engineer their behavior, generates the alteration back into the free market estimate, which allows for the stability of the function, which requires heavy investment to investigate these functions, which would be a nonprofit function or national security interest function, which then, being fully restored, would turn David back into the general, which would then reconnect all of the functions and thus fully imbue the power of green, and thus the ability for the United States and its allies to recover the American hegemony from that arrangement would then be preserved with the existence of male leadership, and thus the outcasting of the toxic femininity from the separatist Confederacy. And this describes the end of the trolley problem, which is to say, would you turn a lever in order to kill one person by moving the train from the tracks to the one person in order to stop the current trajectory of the train going after and killing five people? Now, the position of Fraz-Urb'Luu has generated the systematic tricks in order to get the person to sacrifice themselves, which means that the person who is the one person would then sacrifice themselves and preserve the five. But the five systematically were cultists for the Fraz-Urb'Luu demon lord, at which point the materialization of this problem generates their false heaven in a bubble, which then is systematically removed from its illusion until they are absorbed by the demon lord. And thus, the position for themselves and for others who would have also been targeted would be given the same trolley problem type issue, which, by definition, the thing that is actually functionally good, which they are being tricked into opposing, is pres the preservation of the one good person and tolerating the natural consequences following the destruction of the five cultists, at which point the consequences be damned, they must suffer the side effects of their own poor choices, which culminated in them being tied up on the railroad tracks as a part of the cult ritual. And thus, the obligation generates leaving the lever alone and letting what happens happen. And to this extent, you have that eradication of the problem. And with the destruction of the problem of destroying the cultists causing social ills, then you have actually degraded the demon's position, which has given the false mask or the false face in order to generate sympathy for the criminals and thus the obligation to enforce against them. Requires you to ignore the tactics of the parasite, which has created an infectious poison, which creates an autoimmune disease defect where the immune system doesn't attack the foreign agent and thus corrupts, destroys everything.